Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
I happen to believe that the American Revolution was one of the great events in world history. It was a true revolution, but in a distinctively American sense of the term. When scholars talk about revolutions, the models and examples we usually draw on are what happened in England back in the 1640s, or what happens in France in 1789, or what happens in Russia in 1917, or what happens in China in the 1940s. And so on. So we do have a kind of conventional model of revolution, which seems to imply that, which should entail not only fundamental political change, a major shift in who holds authority and who's going to possess it thereafter, but should really release, really be a response to a whole set of social tensions and, controversies and, overt forms of oppression and suppression of entire groups within society. The American Revolution doesn't really fit that paradigm. It is its own case. The people who are most severely oppressed in America are the slaves, some of whom benefit from the war to flee to freedom with the British, but slavery was not essentially affected by the outcome of the Revolution. The social dimensions of the Revolution, if you compare it to France or Russia or whatever, don't seem all that interesting, don't seem all that profound. So it's easy to say in your first pass that the American Revolution was really off by itself. It's kind of an isolated example. Doesn't really fit the bill of what we really ought to mean when we talk about revolutions. But on the other hand, is where I come out on this, the American Revolution represented a profound transformation in the very nature of political authority within the Western world. It did become a remarkable exercise and a successful exercise in the creation of new Republican governments that would not drift back into authoritarian models, that were not overtly oppressive in the way many of the regimes coming out of the French or the Russian or the Chinese revolutions would turn to be. It did require a great deal of citizen involvement. It did attract a lot of popular support, but without having the kind of turbulent and often destructive consequences that we see with other revolutions. And I think in some ways the guy who captures this best was Thomas Jefferson. In the spring of 1776, Jefferson really wanted to be back in Virginia. He didn't want to be stuck in Philadelphia, having to write the Declaration of Independence. He wanted to be back in Virginia to have a share in drafting Virginia's new constitutional government. And in a letter he writes in May 1776, he says, "This is the whole object of the present controversy, because if we don't successfully establish new forms of government, why should we go to the risk and the cost of waging war with Great Britain if we wind up essentially the same situation we were at the outset?" In one sense, this is a terribly naive notion. The idea, Jefferson actually proposes maybe members of Congress who are doing nothing more nor less than essentially running the war ought to be allowed to go back home, given some kind of holiday for the actual business of running the war, to participate in drafting state constitution. So that was a kind of typically naive statement on Jefferson's part. But the insight he had went to the very heart of what the revolution was meant to be. The idea that its real testing point, that its real purpose, that its real value would reside in the question, is it really possible for men to decide for themselves whether or not they can be governed by institutions they have rationally and consciously created at a particular historic moment? That was a great conceptual breakthrough, and the real promise, and I think the success of the revolution, lay in working out what that really meant in the decade that followed the Declaration of Independence.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.